Hello everyone, welcome to the latest webinar from Natural Capital Partners on carbon footprinting for business and how to streamline the process. My name is Rebecca Fay, I'm Marketing Director here at Natural Capital Partners, and I'd like to welcome you all today to hear some advice on how to run an efficient carbon footprinting process. We have three speakers with us today. Tom Popple, who's responsible for working with many of Natural Capital Partners clients on their carbon management programs, and he'll talk to us about why this is important. He'll be followed by James Blake from RSK Environment. RSK is an environmental consultancy and it has many years experience on carbon footprinting, and James will discuss how to ensure you get high quality results from your measurement program. And last but definitely not least, we have Toni Robinson from Grundon. Grundon is a UK-based waste management business that has taken a very proactive position on managing its environmental impact, including carbon neutral certification. And Toni will give us the perspective of a user on how to make the measurement process effective and valuable for the business. Just to remind you all, the webinar is scheduled to last 45 minutes and we'll leave 10 to 15 minutes at the end for questions. You are all on mute, so please use the panel on the right-hand side of the screen to submit any questions and we'll go through all of those at the end. And with that, I'm very pleased to hand over to my colleague Tom.
Great, thanks Rebecca, and good afternoon everybody. So often for our clients when working with them on carbon footprinting, it can seem relatively new or mystical, or often actually the dark arts. But in fact, it's very much part of normal business reporting. And for the last 20 years, we've been supporting organizations across the world undertake carbon footprint assessments. Around 2,000 assessments have been completed to date. So carbon footprinting for many organizations is actually an evolution. It's a journey of normal business reporting, which typically started in financial reporting, understanding the metrics, the impacts that a business has, and compiling them and managing them in a way that can help inform business strategy and decisions. Carbon footprint is all about measuring, understanding, and managing the carbon and environmental impacts of the business. The drivers for action have been twofold, and we can put them into two clear buckets. One, reactionary. So that's compliance-led typically, where organizations fall within certain regulations or legislations, where they have to report their carbon emissions to third parties and entities, such as in the UK through mandatory carbon reporting, or across the EU through ESOS for certain environmental and GHG impacts. Or indeed it could be under conditional requirements, i.e. working with particular suppliers, organizations may have to undertake a carbon footprint to report the impacts their business has to their suppliers for their own reporting. The other side of this, and predominantly where we operate and our clients operate, is proactively, to undertaking voluntary action to understand the environmental impacts businesses are having. So this can be as part of an organized environmental management system approach, such as ISO. It can indeed be informed to target emission reductions across the business and operations, such as science-based targets. Or for many organizations, particularly those in manufacturing with large operations, it's around understanding cost savings. So where are our impacts and where can we identify reductions that can have material impacts on the business. For the last 15 years, we've also been operating carbon neutrality, and many of our clients are required underneath the carbon neutral protocol to undertake a third-party assured GHG assessment in order to have an independent baseline of their carbon footprint. As organizations are becoming more aware of their environmental impacts, organizations are taking leadership positions on carbon management and actually need a robust, independent and credible footprint in order to report to stakeholders externally. So in an era of data and big data, and blockchain and the like, carbon footprints really are the interface between science and business strategy. A well-managed business should have an acute awareness of the business's environmental and climate change impacts. The assessment provides that robust, credible and trusted data which helps to inform, shape and define business strategy. It's about understanding where the company has impacts and where it needs to reduce those in order to increase the value of the business, to grow and expand into new markets, and to have positive impact that stakeholders can be aware of. It's also about achieving that elusive goal of decoupling business growth from carbon impacts. Carbon assessment is the fundamental part of that to understand the metrics and impacts that a business has over time. So what is a carbon footprint? So essentially it's a measurement of the business's impact on climate change, and that is the amount of greenhouse gases that are produced through the operations of the business. And what often we are asked by organizations, well, what is our footprint and what should we measure? And typically there are two different types of carbon footprint that we operate with and our clients look at. Firstly, it's organizational. So this is really understanding the carbon footprint of the direct operations and the direct impacts of a business, such as fuel emissions and fuel sources. Second to that is purchasing electricity or other energy sources. But also it's important and material for organizations to understand the wider impacts that their operations have, such as business travel or waste. So organizational footprints wrap up all of the different metrics that are required within that approach. The second approach we look at is product. So depending on the particular business goals and the activities that are undertaken, businesses would want to know the impact of their product through its life cycle, typically from cradle to grave. And this is what it looks like. So the first emission scopes of organizational footprint are direct emissions, so those that are coming from company facilities such as offices, sites, manufacturing locations, but also company-owned vehicles. On scope 2, the indirect, this is the purchase of electricity or steam or heating that organizations have. Under the carbon neutral protocol, we define as a carbon neutral business, it's important for businesses to go beyond the scope 1 and scope 2 impacts and look at scope 3, both upstream and downstream. For carbon neutral business certification, it's important to include waste, business travel, and also those sites or locations that are leased. For manufacturing companies, it's also important to include the transportation and distribution of the products that you offer to your customers if you are the party responsible for sending such products, and also for the transportation and distribution of the raw materials to input. As I mentioned, the product footprint actually spans across all three scopes, and this is where it can get complex often for businesses. It's important to understand the boundary of your responsibility, what you should measure, and perhaps what your customers should measure. It's important to work with organizations such as RSK Group to understand that boundary for your particular business and what responsibility you have to measure. And so how can you measure your footprint? There are three clear approaches that we see with clients that we work with. Typically, for organizations that have capacity and capability in-house and manage their carbon emissions by reporting their business metrics through Excel or another workbook. And it's a great tool and an easy access tool for all organizations to start off with recording data associated with their environmental impact. Some organizations have in-house software. This may relate to your procurement, IT or other services systems, which actually has a facility for you to add on GHG reporting or indeed the metrics and emission sources. And finally, there are specialist software organizations out there that have dedicated tools and resources that are used for reporting and monitoring greenhouse gas emissions and indeed other sustainability impacts that should be relevant to the business. And finally, a lasting thought here is actually what we see is carbon management is truly a proxy for good management. That is that organizations are aware of the impacts they have as a business and the risk that can pose now and in the future to their future business growth and indeed their customers and other stakeholders. This piece of research analyzing FTSE 100 companies actually identified that 66% of them are currently assessing the risk from climate change, and 58% of those are actually adapting their business to deal with the impacts of climate change and to manage their future business growth strategies effectively. And it's important to understand that all of this starts with a carbon footprint, a footprint of their own operations, understanding what impacts they have, but also of their suppliers, and to identify material risks now and in the future.
Thanks, Tom. That was a really useful insight into why a business should measure their carbon footprint. And so I think it leads nicely on to James, who's going to talk give some information about how to do that with good data quality. So James, over to you.
Thanks, Rebecca. Thanks, Tom, and good afternoon, everybody. So this next session, we're going to look at the importance of data quality in carbon footprinting. If we can move on to the next slide, please. We're going to introduce uncertainty in carbon footprinting and how that can be minimized and recorded. We're going to look at various sources of best attainable data for various types of emission sources and categories. But we're also going to touch on sources of benchmark factors that are available in those instances when highest quality, for example, metered data isn't available. We all live in the real world, so it's important to be able to progress carbon footprinting, sometimes using only estimated data for certain sources, and really looking to make continual year-on-year improvement to try and drive the quality of the underlying data up year on year. Next slide, please. So as touched on by Tom, carbon footprinting is fundamentally multiplying activity data by an emissions factor to derive the carbon emissions. This example there, using the UK current electricity grid. Now, uncertainty can be introduced on both of those inputs, both the activity data and the emissions factor. For most, certainly UK businesses, selecting the correct factor from UK government, the DEFRA UK greenhouse gas emissions factors, will ensure that uncertainty from that source is really kept to a minimum. So the focus of these following slides is really on the activity data and ensuring that that's of the highest quality it can be. Next slide, please. Thank you. This table is an extract from the Greenhouse Gas Protocol on calculating measurement and uncertainty in greenhouse gas emissions. There's a link in the bottom right of the slide. Anyone interested in looking at that document? You'll see even high quality data has some uncertainty, plus minus 5% is its deemed uncertainty rating. You can see how that significantly increases as data quality diminishes, and at the lower level, poor quality data, that's really 30% upwards. There's no upper limit on what that uncertainty might be. The Greenhouse Gas Protocol reference there, it does provide methodology for calculating uncertainty per emission source and aggregating that to derive an overall uncertainty range for your carbon footprint, but that's slightly beyond what we're looking at here. We'll be focusing here on how to go about getting the highest quality data. Sorry, can we just move back to that last slide? The final point here, please. Obviously, the uncertainty range goes both ways. It's plus and minus. You can underestimate or overestimate the carbon footprint. For the purposes of offsetting, clearly there's a big need to avoid underestimating. So again, that points to using and focusing on the use of high quality data and recording where that isn't available for future assessments. Okay, this is a further extract from the Greenhouse Gas Protocol Guide, and what it very helpfully does is present what's the highest possible data quality for various emission sources. So we'll just run through these one by one. The first relates to those organisations that have on-site fuel combustion, typically gas or oil perhaps. Generally this is typically metered, such supplies, or there will be accurate delivery records which make the calculation of emissions from that source highly accurate. Moving down to process emissions, so these are organisations, companies that typically manufacture and will have emissions coming from those processes that contribute to climate change. So again, if they've got accurate records of inputs and outputs allowing mass balance calculations, very highly accurate results can be derived with very low uncertainty rankings. If those emissions are calculated based on averages, production totals and industry averages, then that data quality is fair or poor at best. For those organisations owning or leasing vehicles, the highest quality data is achieved through fuel use, maybe perhaps through a fuel card system for company cars, allows very highly accurate totals of diesel, petrol and other fuels to be recorded and simply multiplied by their particular factors. Some organisations that don't record fuel use may approach the assessment by looking at total mileage perhaps, or perhaps only estimating distance travelled, which will yield very poor quality data. Next slide, please. Electricity. So all businesses will use electricity. Some of those will generate it themselves on site, perhaps with a generator or combined heat and power. Again, that yields a very high quality data through metering. Most of us don't. Most of us get our power from the grid. That's derived from multiple fuel sources, and we'll apply an annual average for the particular 12-month period that we're footprinting. So that tends to yield at best fair quality data that might have a significant uncertainty associated with it. Some organisations might not be metered, or there might be tenants in a much larger building, so it's not even possible to get metered data. Their electricity consumption might have to be estimated through looking at what equipment is used and how often it's used, or perhaps by floor area, and we'll come on to look shortly at some sources of benchmark data for when that's the case. Inbound, outbound freight, generally now this is much better documented, and companies offering these services can provide high quality data on the distances, routes and modes of travel, which allows for very good accurate results. Business travel. Again, most companies, they might record this via expenditure. They might use third-party travel agents that can provide much more accurate records on modes. They might only have expenditure. And again, we'll come on to some options for allowing estimates of emissions where companies only have expenditure available. Waste, you'll see there is fair at best. It's quite tricky to get very accurate figures for waste, even if all the waste arising from a particular company were weighed and whether they were landfilled or recycled or incinerated. If all that information was known, there tends to be such variability within the wastes that it's hard to get above fair. Now in the real world, lots of organisations, particularly perhaps smaller ones, it might be difficult to get accurate data. Maybe a tenant in a much larger building, the landlord themselves might not have a meter for their building. The list of documents here, the first by the Building Services Research and Information Association, their Rules of Thumb edition. If you follow the first link in the bottom right hand corner, that allows you to download this document. It's freely available, and we'll look shortly at the kind of information that provides, and that allows reasonable estimates of energy consumption, both fossil fuel and electrical, for various different building types. It also gives estimates of water consumption by staff, for example, staff numbers. The second document by the Chartered Institute of Building Service Engineers provides perhaps more detailed factors for some additional building types, offices, whether they are air-conditioned or natural, for example, but that document isn't freely available. I think there's a small charge to CIBC for that, but it does have a wealth of information in there. And finally, DEFRA published a report in 2013 on environmental reporting guidelines, including mandatory carbon reporting, and Appendix E of which provides some pretty useful factors based on gross, as in including VAT expenditure on a range of business activities, which include road transport, air transport, banking, finance, various outsource activities. Whilst these factors haven't unfortunately been updated since 2013, I'm not sure when an update is available, they nevertheless provide a very useful way of estimating until such time that processes and systems are in place to capture more accurate data. Last slide, please. This is just an extract from the BISRIA document, which shows the kind of information that's available. So highlighted there is data for office buildings, which provides both electrical and fossil fuel consumption figures, kilowatt hours per square metre, or even CO2 emission benchmarks based from that consumption. So it's simply a case of understanding the floor area of your premises and applying these factors to estimate that consumption or emissions. And what I would stress here, which is good practice within any carbon footprint, is to make sure that for each of your emissions categories, you're clearly recording the source of data, whether there's any estimation or assumption involved, so that in future greenhouse gas assessments, when perhaps additional processes have been put in place, there's the ability to enhance that data and therefore the accuracy and robustness of the footprint. Thank you.
Thanks, James. There's been one question came in, which I think it would just be good to quickly ask you now to just clarify a point of clarification on what the sort of concept of the poor, good and high quality of data. So one of our listeners has asked if, is poor good enough? If the data is all in that sort of threshold of poor, is that good enough? Or is that not acceptable, and is a footprint always be looking to make sure that the data is of the high quality? What is good enough?
Well, that's a very good question. I mean, those rankings really relate to the uncertainty rather than, in effect, the quality of the data. Poor might be the best, and for many organisations that don't have access to the accurate data or are using the grid factors, which I would say is a large majority of organisations, then that's absolutely fine and acceptable. But it's just a case of recognising that even those best attainable elements for a particular organisation will have a degree of uncertainty associated with them. As was indicated for waste, really fair is the highest possible level of accuracy that can currently be got, without much, a lot of work in understanding waste arisings and so forth. So poor or good is totally acceptable if that's the highest that can be obtained.
Great, thanks for that clarification, James. And so now it's time to hand over to Toni Robinson from Grundon Waste Management. So yeah, Toni, looking forward to hearing about actually, how a company is using a carbon footprint so successfully and effectively for the business.
Thank you, Rebecca, and good afternoon, everyone. Firstly, I thought it'd be useful to provide you with an overview of the company to allow you to get an understanding of our business and why we actually embarked on this carbon journey. So the company is the largest UK family-owned waste management business. It was founded in 1929 by Stephen Grundon, and the family is still very much involved and steers the direction of the business. The company operates across the southern England, with the head office being near Wallingford in Oxfordshire, with the majority of our sites being in Berkshire, Oxfordshire and Gloucestershire. So if you're in the north of the country, you may not have even heard of us. The company prides itself in being able to provide our customers with a total waste management solution, including the collection, treatment, recovery, recycling and disposal of non-hazardous waste streams, in addition to dealing with all aspects of hazardous waste, including contaminated materials and clinical waste. Over the years, Grundon has developed a distinctive approach that has helped us to maintain a leading position within the industry. This approach is underpinned by our commitment to quality of service, innovation and technical progress, together with a genuine and demonstrable concern for the environment. Our carbon journey really started in the late 1990s. Like many other companies then, we started to consider how we should reduce our impact on the environment. But to do this, we realised we need to understand what our actual impact was and where our efforts should be focused. There were a number of drivers that led us to think about this. Firstly, the work that was being done by Green Alliance. If you're not familiar with this organisation, they're actually a charity, and as described on their website, are an independent think tank focused on ambitious leadership for the environment. During this period, they carried out a 3-year project to produce environmental performance indicators for the waste management sector. The report was finally published in 2001. This project was endorsed by 11 waste management companies, and Grundon was one of those, as well as our trade body, the ESA, and relevant institutes such as CIWM, plus Friends of the Earth and Waste Watch, etc. I will actually continue to refer to this publication throughout my presentation. Secondly, Grundon was going through the process of becoming certified to ISO 14001. As part of this, we really needed to understand the real impact we were having on the environment. It meant we needed to understand, the impact at individual locations so that we could put local improvements in place. Thirdly, it was our customers. Our customers wanted reassurance that we really understood the impact that we were having on the environment and we were managing it appropriately. As we all know, businesses can easily put statements out to show their environmental commitment, but without facts and figures to back them up. These have really no value. Grundon did not want to make any such sweeping statements without the data being there to back it up. Finally, and definitely not last, our staff. The majority of employees feel that they work for an environmental business and have an important part to play in managing the resources, or more commonly known as waste, that we deal with daily. By being able to provide this environmental information to our staff, it led us to better understanding and ownership, which allowed the company to see continuous improvement. So, unlike many businesses, we were not calculating our footprint as part of a corporate report or to provide information to our shareholders, but because we really wanted to understand our environmental impact, and then with this knowledge, we'd be able to put measures in place to reduce it. So once we started this journey, we had to decide what we were going to measure and make those agreements. And I think this is key, and really to set this in stone. The company is spread across many different sites with different types of facilities. As a business, the directors agreed that everything should be within scope. The company also owns restored landfill sites, and it would have been quite easy to scope those out as they're not operational. Many of them are just restored fields, but we decided to put it within scope so that we've actually included everything that historically we own and everything currently operational. Personally, I really do feel that if you scope any part of your business out of your calculations, you really need to understand why and be able to justify it. So we then had to decide on which emissions to include, whether they should be just direct ones or also to include indirect ones. This was where the Green Alliance publication was extremely useful, as it provided the indicators that research had shown was suitable for use within the waste management industry and the emissions that should be considered. For example, one of the indicators was total greenhouse gas emissions divided by tonnes of waste handled. Within the guidance regarding this, it detailed the 6 greenhouse gases that needed to be considered and the specific emissions that emit these gases. Indicators such as this allowed us to identify the data that we needed to collect to be able to report as per the industry standard. So at this point, we'd identified the locations we were going to cover, the sites, the information we needed to gather. We then just had the fun of trying to collate this information. Some of the data was very easy to collect, but others proved very difficult. For example, electricity. For the largest sites, we had accurate information on daily use, But our smaller sites, when you start looking at the bills, you find out they were estimated bills, and we actually had no real understanding on the use. Our closed landfills also provided a challenge. They were all restored grassland, so visually we're having no impact. But we knew that through waste degradation, they would be producing landfill gas. Other than the perimeter monitoring we were undertaking, we did not know if anything was escaping from the surface. So as part of these works, we carried out flux box sampling, and that's what the picture is if anybody's been wondering, which has allowed us to get the required data by capturing the gas within basically our upturned bath and doing the various calculations to get that data. You know, data collection, as James has already mentioned, is definitely the hardest element of the process. The accuracy of our data after year one improves significantly, as when you start collecting the data, you really understand what you need and, more importantly, what is missing. Each year, the accuracy of our data is improving as we continue to look at ways of being more accurate in our methods, such as installing half-hourly electric meters at our sites, better fuel monitoring software, electricity monitoring software, and our staff being more diligent in recording this data. Yeah, the final consideration as part of this process was which conversion factors to use to convert all the data to the CO2 equivalent. When you start looking into this, there is such a variation between different data sources. We now use the DEFRA greenhouse gas conversion factors for the majority of our conversions, as this information is readily available and is from an approved source. If I can have the next slide, thanks. So after all these decisions and data collection, we finally published our first corporate environmental report to cover the year 2000. It was very much based on the methods and indicators detailed within the Green Alliance publication. Since then, we've continued to publish our total footprint, as well as the different indicators that allow us to compare our impact against our activities. These indicators are key, as it allows the business to grow and adapt, but allows ongoing comparisons. The next slide shows how our, sorry, can I go to the next slide? Shows how our annual footprint has reduced over the years, as well as a graph showing the annual comparison in relation to the tonnes of waste we've handled. As you can see, both these graphs are similar in shape, but the one relating to the waste handled is a smoother curve with less variation year on year. Personally, I find it slightly frustrating that some of these variations seen are not due to actually Grundon's activities, but related to the way we carry out the calculations. You may actually be wondering what I mean here. So, for example, the conversion factors can change over the years. One example that has affected our landfill emissions is the conversion factor we use for methane. Landfill gas, which is a byproduct of the process, consists of about 45% methane. So in 2000, when we started measuring, the conversion factor that the emissions needed to be multiplied by was 21, and it's now 25. So you can see by changes in the government's emissions, it can have a significant, or changes in the government's conversion factors, it can have a significant impact, negative impact on your footprint, although on the ground there are actually no changes or improvements have been made. I have a number of similar examples, but it really shows the importance of understanding your data and being able to document these changes. This is one reason we've always done these calculations in-house, as it means we really understand what is included and any limitations. If I can go to the next slide. As a company, we are continuing to look at ways of reducing our footprint, but compared to initial years, these changes really do not lead to such a significant reduction. Our biggest impact is related to our landfills, and in the early years we invested heavily in ensuring that these were properly capped so we could capture the landfill gas, which allowed us then to pass it through engines to produce electricity. These schemes mean that as a business we actually produce more electricity than we use, and the office I'm sat in today is being, the electricity has been generated from our landfill gas. On these sites we have also planted 35,000 trees, again which has a positive impact. So when we consider the full picture on our landfills in relation to that area of the business, we feel we're actually having a negative impact, and so the carbon footprint is almost offset in the activities within the landfill. The second largest source of emissions and a fundamental part of the business is our transport fleet, and this is the part of the business that is visible to our customers and the public. We continue to invest in newer lorries and look at new technologies to allow us to reduce the actual emissions further. This continues to be our biggest real impact, and that is why in 2014 we decided to offset these emissions through the CarbonNeutral certification. We have just entered our 4th year and continue to support a reforestation project in Uganda. Can I have the next slide? Since the start of 2014, our vehicle fleet has travelled just over 21.5 million miles. I do have accurate data on that. Equivalent to travelling from the UK to Uganda over 5,300 times. Although the benefits of offsetting are not seen in this country, it is fantastic to know that we truly are having a global impact, as our carbon credits are being used to support this reforestation project, which organises hundreds of small community-based tree planting initiatives. The Grundon support in the last 3 years has allowed this project to develop, and since 2014 more than 1,180 farmers have joined the project, forming 231 new community groups and planting more than 1.3 million trees. As a whole, the project has continued to grow, making such a difference to so many people's lives in Uganda, as well as planting in excess of 6 million trees. So, in summary, the carbon footprinting journey that Grundon has been on has really allowed us to understand the business from a different perspective, and has allowed us to look at ways of improving our environmental credential. This in turn has benefited our customers and has allowed us to continue to differentiate ourselves from our competitors. So thank you.
Thank you, Toni. That was excellent. Thank you very much, everyone. We've got quite a few questions, so and we want to make sure we do finish punctually. So we'll get through as many as we can in the time we've got left. And anyone, if we aren't able to answer your question now, we will follow up with you afterwards. First question is for James, is a fairly sort of practical, tactical question. James, is there any advice you'd give to someone who's struggling to get the data they require from other departments in their organisation?
Well, that's a good question and a common issue. I guess to make sure that there's real senior level management buy-in, to stress the importance of the exercise to the organisation. In the ideal world, I think people collecting the data will be self-selecting, maybe as a local CR rep for that office, an area that they have of interest to them. But it's it can be challenging, and maybe more face-to-face meetings, and really trying to engage and make the importance of the exercise understood. Some companies might incentivize as well, both for reporting and for setting of targets for emissions or energy reduction.
Thanks, James, and that actually leads us very nicely onto a question for Tom. When it comes to that sort of senior management, getting senior management buy-in in order to get good data collection throughout the organisation, Tom, have you got any advice on what a company could say to convince a CFO of an organisation that measuring a carbon footprint is worth doing, and what the wider benefits are beyond enabling carbon reduction, beyond setting the baseline for enabling carbon reductions?
Sure, and another question. So often carbon footprint, like other environmental metrics, is it often be seen as a proxy for cost. And that's one thing that the CFO understands, and they also understand metrics and numbers. So actually presenting the case for undertaking a carbon footprint can often actually be something the CFO advocates for and wants to see, because he understands it and it's a way for him to manage another risk to the business and show value back to the owners and to the shareholders. And I also think it's important for the CFO to understand within this process that you can't let perfection be the enemy of the good, and for him to understand that there's a decision to be made on the way the business moves forward is important for him to see the numbers.
Thanks, Tom. Toni, a question for you, which again is a sort of practical point, which I think is probably a very common issue with carbon footprinting, is, you know, how many other people in the organization did you have to involve in the data collection in order to get your footprint?
Thanks, Rebecca. If I consider, you know, carbon footprinting now within the business, I would suggest that we probably involve the majority of people, and I think this, you know, is a sort of lesson learnt, because if you involve people in collecting the data, they understand it and understand they have a part to play. So, for example, you know, the majority of our workforce, or a large proportion of our workforce, are our drivers. So they understand the need to record the diesel use accurately. And it's those little parts and them having ownership which I think's made it work within our business, and I do believe, you know, we now collect very accurate data. Thank you.
Thanks, Toni. I'm going to take a crack at the next question, because a lot of what I do is work with our clients on their sort of what claims they make about their programs and their reputation. So we have a question about whether it's common for businesses to face accusations of greenwashing, and do we advise companies on how best to deal with such issues? So my response to that would be that, one, I think it is less common now for businesses to face accusations of greenwashing. I think that has, but now that there are clear benchmarks for best practice in terms of carbon management and emissions reductions, and so many more companies are doing it, I think that it is less of an issue, as opposed to probably between, you know, sort of 5-10 years ago, when it was quite a new thing, and the same benchmarks for what sort of good behavior and best practicing is weren't so well established. So I think it is less common. We do, of course, advise our clients on how best to deal with that, because a lot of what we're doing with clients is making sure that they get the reputational benefit from their programs. So, you know, that advice would include making sure that that our clients talk about the issues that are most material to their business, and don't hide the more material ones to talk about the easier, less material issues, that they obviously don't overstate what they're doing, and that they are accurate in terms of what they say. And we will review almost all of our clients, send them any content that they're planning to put out externally, will send it to us first to have to review it and check that it does accurately reflect their programs. The other things that you know, Toni was talking about carbon neutral certification, and a couple of things about that is that the carbon neutral certification is underpinned by a protocol which is updated every year to help with that sort of credibility of claim, and all clients who are carbon neutral certified must have their footprint checked by a third party. So that's all to avoid those issues. With that, we do have one other question. Unfortunately, we haven't got time for that, so we will come back to that as a separate response. And I'd like to thank everyone for all your time today. I'd like to thank our speakers and everyone for attending. The webinar will be recorded, so it will be sent, a link to that will be sent out to everyone, and please feel free to share it with your colleagues. And I hope you all enjoy the spring weather that here in London we are finally seeing. And thank you very much once again.